Okay, so I guess I'll introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm Sven. I work and live in Belgium for a company called Umbraco. Um, Before I came into developing, I used to make chocolates, amongst other things. And in my spare time, I mainly amuse myself with gaming, making games, and the odd tinkering with electronics and other stuff, whatever floats my boat at that point. Um, as the title indicates, I'm gonna give a quick introduction to dependency injection and how you can use it in Umbraco, especially in Umbraco 8. So what will we be covering? I'm gonna explain in my own words what dependency injection is. I'm going to give a real life analogy to hopefully make it click in a lot of people's minds. I'm also going to show what inversion of control containers bring to the table and what it makes easier with dependency injection. And then I'm going to quickly give all the advantages and then show a working demo, hopefully. So first of all, what is dependency injection? In my own words, dependency injection is a software technique or pattern that helps you supply an object with every object that it needs or depends on to execute its own logic. Doing it this way, you create, you make your code adhere more to the solid principles, two of them really, one being the single responsible principle, because the object that needs the dependencies does not need to create its objects, it receives it. And if you use interfaces to establish your dependency injection, you also satisfy the de-insolid being dependency inversion principle, which says that you should program against an interface or an abstraction, not the actual implementation. And because you are, because you're removing or consolidating where you are creating objects and not in multiple classes if you creating the same service to be used in 3 consumers, for example, you are also keeping your code dry because you're doing that in one place instead of multiple places. Yeah, that's it. So a real world analogy. Let's say we have a construction yard and we have a boss man standing in front of the gate. And when they're starting the construction, he yells, "I need a new worker." And luckily there's somebody around and he says, "Hey, what's up, boss? I'm ready to work and I've brought my own tools." And the boss says, "Oh, that's great. Then I don't have to do, then I don't have to supply your tools." And he says, "Come on in." And then the boss says, "I need another worker." And then the other one shows up and he also brings his own tools and he joins the construction yard as well. So at this point, we have 2 entities in a system, both generating or creating or bringing along their own tools that they need to operate. The problem with this, or one of the problems that can arise with this, is that they need to do a task and they're both doing more or less the same thing, but not exactly the same thing. And then when something goes wrong, the boss is sad because he doesn't know why. Is it the worker that's not working fine? Is it one of his tools that is not working fine? Or is it because they're working on the same project and one tool is interrupting another one's? So the boss at that point has a lot of places where he can look for the error. The boss in this analogy is the coder, right? Because we write code to do these things. So how can we resolve this? Well, when the boss says, "I need a new worker," the worker shows up and he says, "Hey, I want to work, but can you supply me the tools that you want me to use?" And then somebody or something else says, "Sure, here's, for example, all the drill bits that you're gonna need, the drill and the power cord for that drill and the fuse that goes into that power cord, well, in the plug of that power cord." And everything is assembled and ready to use. And the person goes in, another worker shows up, same thing happens, so supplies the drill again. They both end up in the construction yard and they execute their work with exactly the same tools, reducing the chance of something bad happening. It doesn't solve everything, it just helps you make the boss a little bit happier because he has more control over what the people who are working for them do, because he has control over the tools that they're using. That's the analogy. So what is inversion of control? Inversion of control is also a pattern. I'm not going to go into it, but it states more or less that you should work against interfaces, that the higher level components should supply the lower level components with implementations. And one of the tools that can be used for that and dependency injection is an inversion of control container. It works as a central place where you define all your dependencies, and then it usually, but doesn't have to be, also supplies those dependencies to whoever needs it, whoever states, I need this to start working. Luckily, Umbraco 8 and, for example, Inversion.core or other frameworks as well supply some form of ISC container that you can hook into so that you have all the things available that the framework delivers, and you can add your own or replace the ones that the framework gives you. For Umbraco 8, for example, there are there's a default URL provider. If you at one point want to replace that completely, replace the way Umbraco supplies the default URL for a content node, you can do that. You can overwrite the one that is already in the container when Umbraco is started, and you start plugging in. So, advantage of using dependency injection: it is easier to maintain your code because the creation of the same object is not spread out over multiple other objects, like I said before. Because of this, it is easier to swap out an implementation because you only have to do it in one place. And because of this, it is easier to unit test because instead of creating all the objects and objects within the objects and so forth and so on, you define them once and then you can start unit testing. It's also easier to build up complex dependency chains because you supply every component, and however those components fit into one another doesn't really matter because your IRC container can take care of that. And it is easier to plug in things into existing frameworks because they give you that container to replace items and add items into. That's dependency injection quickly gone over. I'm probably cut a couple of corners here and there. In questions later or after the talk, we can discuss those if you want to. Let's move on to dependency injection in Umbraco 8. So to use what is present in Umbraco 8, we usually need to do two things. One, we need to register our implementation into the existing container in Umbraco, and then at any point in the Umbraco flow, so for example, in a surface controller or in our MVC controller or wherever, we need to define that we need a certain dependency. So how do we register our implementation? Like I said, a framework can define a lot of components ready for you to use, and then you can add onto them. So Umbraco does this as well. It creates a container. You cannot at any point just say, add this to the container. You need to do it in a specific way. And the way that Umbraco does this is with components. So you define a component that inherits from an iUser composer. And then when you're composing this, you say composition.register. I want to register a dependency, what abstraction you're registering to, and the implementation, and you define a lifetime. A lifetime is basically the scope of that object. So for MVC, because every request to the web server only lives for that amount of time. If you need something that needs a fresh set of data, you define lifetime.request, and at the end, it is discarded. You can also define dependencies as singletons, and then they live for the whole time of your application. If you do that, then know that it lives for that whole time. So if you're storing data in that implementation, it can change across all the different requests. So as long as it only looks up and not keeps data in its memory, you can use a singleton, but otherwise I would go for another lifetime. I'll show documentation to this as well during the demo, where there's more explanations about this. And then the other side is getting out the dependency. It's really easy, just do it in the constructor. So when we have a controller and we need something, some kind of dependency, it can be a service, it can be a calculator, it can be a repository to store things, it doesn't matter. In the controller, you just say, I need this, and then you keep a local copy of it to use inside your methods. So, demo time. So what do we have set up here? We have a simple surface controller that renders a form and handles the submit of that form. And in that submit form, we have some code that sends that message somewhere. In this instance, it uses an SMTP client to send an email. So when we run this, we get a simple form. We fill the name, we fill an email address, and we say this is without the dependent. We submit it. The form was sent. The email is sent, and just to show you, it sends an email with, the name and everything. So we're not going to go over how this is done. This is standard Umbraco. The question is, how can we do the same thing with dependency injection? I'm just going to swap to another branch so that So what has changed? All that code here is gone, and we are instead injecting a iCommunication service. We're saving a reference to that service, and we're saying send comment to host, because that is the intention that we want to do. And then how that is done, whether it's with an email client, whether it's a message on Slack, on Twitter, doesn't matter. We send a comment to the host with this name from this email address with this comment. So the implementation is exactly the same as we had. So this one. So same thing, we create a message and we send it over as SMTP. So how does this get set up? Well, like I said during the presentation, we need to define a module. So we define a new component based off our user components. All the documentation can be found here for this. And in the compose method that is called by Umbraco, when this component is loaded in, we register our service. And then on the controller, like I said, we just ask for it, we get it, and we can use it. So if we run this, we should get exactly the same email. There we go. So send is with dependency injection. And then we get a new email. And it's exactly the same one, except for the message has changed because we filled in a different message. Now, this might seem silly to do it this way, and that's probably why a lot of people don't do it from the get-go, because you're writing quite a lot of extra code. You're writing a module to register it, then you're abstracting your code into a service. All in all, it's good practice, but people usually don't see the reason why you should use dependency injection. So let's pretend, well, not pretend, let's show that when the dependency chain is a lot more complex, that dependency injection can help you quite a lot. So we have a new service, a co-patch service, and that co-patch service asks a text dazzler, whatever that is, to do something else. And that text dazzle service asks a configuration supplier to give it some configuration as well. That configuration supplier can get its configuration hard-coded, which in this case it is, or it can get it from a database or from a configuration file. It really doesn't matter, because the consumer of it only cares for the fact that it gets that configuration. So if you were to do this without dependency injection, every time that you wanted to use a communication service, you would have to supply it its every time that communication service would call this method, it would have to create a new instance of a text dazzler and a new instance of the configuration supplier, and that can get quite tedious, and it can also increase the difficulty for when somebody takes over a project and they want to just use the communication service, that they have to go looking what all the other things it needs are. While if you set it up correctly, the next time that somebody needs the communication service, you just ask for it and everything is supplied for you. So when we run this example, so because I am using 2 extra dependencies, I have to register them as well. So if we look here, we have the configuration supplier and the text dazzler in there as well, because I know that there's both safe to be used across all requests. I'm giving them a lifetime.singleton, so it's only loaded in memory once. So when we run this one, it'll now with more send this. Then for the calling code, we're still sending a comment to the host, still exactly the same, but the service behind it is doing more things. And this time we get some nice carrots in our message, because all the extra services do those things. And that's it, really.